Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ash here coming at you today in Clash Royale. Excited to share another pro tips episode for you guys, and it's another first timer onto the channel. It is Yui, aka TheArrow, and we're going to review 3 matches versus some of the game's best players versus TheArrow, and we're going to talk about one specific deck that has got him to #1 in the world many times now, and it's a classic Giant Loon Freeze deck. So in today's episode, I hope you guys walk away with a better understanding of not just what this deck is and what the cards in it are, but rather how to actually play the deck and have success with it. So just a few of the details that we'll be covering in today's video. Again, I got these straight from Yui's mouth himself. He provided me with a very nice deck write-up to share with you guys on top of his replays. And again, speaking of replays, guys, they're going to be against some of the game's other best players. One of them has been on the channel before, Sushi Pepe. We'll open up things against him, and then we'll move on to Hazard and Trainer Garrett, 2 of the game's finest, along with Sushi, along with TheArrow. So we really have a special treat for you guys in terms of gameplay in the background here. So just a few details that we'll be covering in today's video are ideal opening plays, how to play the Giant, how to play the Balloon and combo the 2, the 4 ways to use the freeze spell in the deck, common mistakes and how to avoid them, and the correct tempo to play this deck. So let's talk about the actual cards in the deck. So there's no legendary cards, but it does have 3 epics, the Balloon, the Freeze, and the Skeleton Army. Now this deck really shines in ladder play, especially if you can level up that Freeze beyond tournament standards, but it's also a good tournament deck. It's really an old school throwback deck, but it's actually very viable in the current meta. So the cards Giant, Balloon, and Freeze are going to be your win conditions, your main combos. Of course, Freeze is flexible. It can also be a defensive card. Anti-graveyard decks, you're going to be relying on Scar Me, on Zap, on Minion, and of course Tombstone in a bind. Air and tank decks, your main weapons are going to be Musketeer, Scar Me, and Tombstone. And against Elite Barbarians and Hog decks, obviously the Scar Me and the Tombstone. And again, guys, don't be afraid to use Freeze. One thing I see, a common mistake on Freeze players, especially ones who are just kind of dabbling with Freeze, you know, they give it a shot and then they go back to a different deck and they don't stick with it for a while, is the reluctance to use Freeze on defense, especially with this deck, right? Because you have enough low-cost options to supplement the Freeze after you play it. So you can play Scar Me, for example, you can play Minions, Tombstone, all 3 or less cost. So guys, let's go ahead and get into the actual deck and how it works. So the ideal first move for this deck is going to be either the Tombstone or the Musketeer. That's what Yui said. He said he really prefers to play one of those first 2 cards. If you don't have either of those cards in your hand for whatever reason, he's not afraid to start out the match with the Giant, but he wants to see obviously what the opponent does first. So let your opponent make the first move if that is the situation. So you'll see right on the screen right now, this is going to be a good example of your win condition in action here. So uses the freeze spell, not necessarily always against the tower there. He used it on the Musketeer, otherwise the Balloon had no shot of getting to the tower. Now it should go without saying that you're not going to want to do that every time. You have to make sure that the tower is targeting your Giant before you go ahead and freeze a Musketeer like that, otherwise your Balloon's going to be critically damaged by the tower as well. Okay, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves here, let's talk about the deck tempo. So I asked Yui, how do you play this deck? Do you play super aggressive? Do you play passively? And he said this is a passive aggressive deck, meaning in the first 2 minutes before the double elixir time, you're gonna play things relatively safe, and that really includes the placement of the Giant. You always want to include him behind your King Tower in the first 2 minutes of the match. He said very rarely, only if the opponent makes a ton of really big mistakes, and a nice 3 crown there against a really great player in Sushi Pepe, but only if the opponent makes a really grave mistake with his elixir, then you're going to want to punish him at the river, at the bridge. But other than that, you're 99 times out of 100 going to be playing your Giant in back of the King Tower and building up a really big push in the first 2 minutes of the match. You can play a little bit more aggressive aggressively later on, but think about it. If you're playing a balloon and a giant at the bridge, that's a 10 elixir commitment, and it's not your grandfather's Clash Royale anymore, right? I mean, when things first started, the balloon and the giant and the freeze are original cards. They've always been in the game, so people used to play this deck much more aggressively a year ago today, right? But now there's a lot more strong defensive options out there that can really make you pay. So that's why when Yui plays the giant balloon combo, he doesn't want to do it at the bridge. He needs to make sure he has elixir left to defend, because if the opponent drops, say, Elite Barbarians, we all know that everybody's playing Elite Barbarians. If the opponent drops Elite Barbarians against your giant at the river, you're screwed, man. You have no elixir left to defend against that counter push. So you have to be very careful, especially if you know your opponent is playing Elite Barbarians. So TheArrow pulled off a really nice combo there, a really nice win condition combo. He played the giant, the balloon, and the freeze, and he caught his opponent a little bit off guard there, because the opponent Hazard played the Musketeer safely in the back there, and he would have been alright defending there, but that was the first time that TheArrow used the freeze that match. So he took him a little bit off guard, and that's how you want to use the freeze spell. The first time you pull it out, you want to make sure you get enough value from it. Try to take your opponent a little bit off guard. Try to take the tower with that first freeze play if you can. So let's go on to the aggressive part. So the last minute of the match and into overtime, you can afford to be a little bit more aggressive with your giant and your balloon play. And you'll notice that Yui does this during the last minute. In the previous match against Sushi, he played the balloon, relentlessly on the opponent's side of the map, because after you defend against their win condition, it gives you a little bit more wiggle room to go super aggressive on the other end. But other than that, guys, I can't stress this enough, and he stressed this a lot to me when giving me the details about the deck that he uses to get him to #1 in the world, and that was, do not risk playing the giant at the bridge unless it's double elixir time A, and unless you know the opponent's win condition isn't going to punish you if you do so B, because this type of deck, you can take the positive elixir advantages and just put them in the bank. Think of it as a bank, right? You don't always need to capitalize on an elixir advantage immediately. I think, even me personally, guys, that's one of my weaknesses, right? I see myself win a bunch of positive elixir trades, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 in a quick succession. So now I know I have maybe a 3 or 4 elixir lead in the match, and then, it's just human nature to want to capitalize immediately. So, okay, I know I have a 4 elixir advantage. I just want to, go at him hard, because I know if I do it right, he won't be able to defend. But with a deck like this, you can build a really nice stack behind a giant and then capitalize for maybe even a 3 crown. Like you saw, both of these happen to be 3 crowns. I wonder how long Yui was saving these replays for me, because they're all super impressive. But either way, you can't get to #1 in the world without being the best to get there, right? So that is the tempo of this deck. You can afford to be a little bit more aggressive towards the end, as with most decks, that goes without saying, but go ahead and transfer those positive elixir trades that you made throughout the match into a big push. You can keep paying it forward, and then eventually you can get a giant, a balloon, a musketeer, minions, all coming at your opponent, and they won't be able to stop you, and eventually, if you do it right, you might even get the 3 crown against them. So that leads me to the freeze. I said there were 4 ways to play the freeze in this deck, and they're all pretty simple, but it's worth noting that Yui advises using all 4 of these methods. The first one is obvious, and you saw it right now on your screen, using the freeze with both the balloon and the giant. The second one is using the freeze with the giant all by himself. Sometimes you can use the freeze with the giant and still get a lot of value. A giant against a frozen tower, if the opponent doesn't play a good defense against it, can take down the tower. So oftentimes the opponent can underestimate, and hopefully you don't make this mistake, but they can underestimate the power of a giant all by himself. So if you can connect a giant to a tower, you can pretty much kiss at least 500 HP goodbye, and hopefully even more if you combo with the freeze spell. So don't be afraid to use the freeze. If the giant's on a tower and your opponent, say, drops a mini P.E.K.K.A. or something on your giant, go ahead and freeze it. You're going to take that tower down. So the other way to play Freeze is with a balloon by itself, but it's worth noting this is Yui's least favorite way to use the Freeze. And ironically, I say that, but there's going to be a solo balloon freeze coming up right now against this Musketeer because, hey, if you know you can take down the tower, you go ahead and you do it. But this is, as I said, Yui's least favorite way to use the Freeze as the balloon is such a fragile unit. The other way is obvious, using the balloon and the giant together in tandem, and then when you freeze whatever the opponent, hold your freeze back a little bit. Hold it back, see what your opponent does, make them commit a lot of elixir to the defense, and then bam, freeze, and then they're left, sitting on their fingers. Okay, that doesn't translate well, but you guys get the point. So make them commit defensively and then freeze so they have no elixir left to do anything with it. The fourth way is using freeze defensively. So use freeze defensively if you have to, although Yui didn't seem to be as keen on using freeze defensively as some of my other pro players have that have shared these pro tip videos with you guys. He really likes to save his freeze for his win condition, but if he has to, he will use it defensively as well. Now, before I let you guys go today, I do want to talk about the most common mistake with this deck, and Yui said that he dealt with it for a long time. Whenever he went to play these giant freeze balloon decks, he would always find himself with a bad rotation late in the match, and he had no idea why. And he started to analyze his own matches, and he really got to the crux of the issue, and that was just simply playing too aggressive with his win conditions too early in the match. So guys, don't play super aggressive. Make sure you find out what counters your opponent has to your deck, and hopefully you'll have a lot of success as Yui, aka TheArrow, has had. So again, huge shout out to Yui for sharing his replays and his advice with all of us. I hope you guys have enjoyed them as much as I have, and as I like to do from time to time, I want to reward some of you guys who have stuck around to the end of this video with a little treat. Now, the Italian YouTuber DragonSteak TV put out a really cool video recently where he imitated almost all the cards from Clash Royale, so I'm going to go ahead and include a link to the full video, but for now, go ahead and wet your palate with this little clip from DragonSteak TV. So guys, thanks so much for watching, and as always, take care, guys.
Showtime! Magic! Fire! Fire! Fireball! Hog Rider! Ha ha! Ha ha! Ha ha! Ha ha! Ha ha!